In the winter of 1941, the average Briton never knew that the most critical room in the British war machine was not on a battlefield, not in a dockyard, not in a bunker along the Channel coast, but directly beneath the pavements of Westminster, 40 feet below the city, in a maze of cramped hallways and narrow, cigarette-smoked rooms. Churchill's war rooms, formerly the Cabinet war rooms, operated like an underground nervous system. The public saw photographs of the Prime Minister touring bomb damage, rallying crowds, standing among ruined masonry. They did not see that these same nights, maps were pinned with red thread, pins marking convoys, circles marking Wolfpack sightings, and that each movement of a supply ship hauling wheat, oil, or munitions had passed through this hidden labyrinth before meeting the brutal mathematics of U-boat strategy. And this is where the story begins. Not with the operational brilliance of the RAF or the cutting-edge Type X cipher machines, but with something far older, secrecy inside the room where only the trusted were allowed. In late 1941, Britain's survival depended on the Atlantic. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Hut 3, Hut 6, Hut 8 had turned the impossible into the routine, decrypting German naval enigma keys on a timetable that would have astonished civilian mathematicians in peacetime. Yet the results coming from Station X were terrifyingly precise. Convoys rerouted based on ultra-intelligence were being intercepted anyway. The Admiralty initially blamed coincidence. The sea is a vast landscape, the distance between escort screens and submarine torpedoes measured in seconds and degrees of bearing. But coincidences began stacking too neatly. Convoy SC-42, HX-79, SC-48. Multiple convoy battles where U-boats knew where to lie in wait before any Luftwaffe shadow aircraft had visual contact. Analysts in Room 40 had once fought the Kaiser's Navy by code. Now, analysts of GC and CS fought a subtler war. And the frightening implication was whispered in the margins of typed situation reports. This did not look like cryptanalytic breakthrough from the German side. It looked like foreknowledge. Churchill famously told his private secretary John Colville, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Those words were memorialized in the PM's own later writing, but the context is sharper when one studies the day logs. In the same window where Churchill used that phrase, November 1941, a technical clerk in signals distribution flagged an anomaly. German U-boat formations appeared to shift position after. Britain requested new routing plans based on fresh ultra-decrypts. The timescale was wrong for direction finding, wrong for traffic analysis. These shifts happened too fast. A small MI5 subsection, B1B, the Counter-Espionage Technical Tracking Unit, logged it. The record is dry, almost antiseptic in language. Possible leak internal to higher office. The memo name checks no one. It speculates nothing. It just draws two arrows on a paper trail. Ultra distribution, number 10 handling, altered German Wolfpack posture. This is the earliest known trace of the suspicion. Inside the war rooms, trust was currency. Less than 200 individuals carried passes granting access to the map room. Among those, only a fraction handled the SLU, Special Liaison Unit, envelopes that delivered ultra-decrypts from Bletchley to the Prime Minister. The envelopes were sealed in numbered pouches, logged, tracked, opened under protocol, summarized again, and often retyped into a more concise form for the PM's morning folder. If the breach existed at all, it existed in that narrowing funnel. Men and women in those rooms lived in a state of constant stress. Air raid sirens above, the dull thump of a V-weapon, the claustrophobia of pipe ducts overhead, and always the pressure to make decisions under incomplete information. It is here that espionage, if it existed, would have thrived, because everyone was exhausted. Mistakes could be masked as fatigue, discrepancies could be explained away as overlapping shifts. Even the routine itself had a rhythm that could be exploited. Decrypts arrived on predictable pulses. Summaries were typed at predictable hours. Couriers moved at predictable times. This is the heart of the mystery, the place where routine meets possibility. We cannot yet name anyone. We cannot yet accuse anyone, but we can mark this moment where the archival evidence shifts from assumption to quiet, internal unease. The leak, if real, was inside the room where Churchill slept during the Blitz. And the stakes, 20 merchant ships a week, thousands of men, the survival of Britain. The question is now unavoidable. Who or what network had access to the PM's ultra sheets? Next part will trace the first concrete anomaly involving convoy routing. It began as a personnel audit, the type no one in government notices, the sort of dry internal review that appears in file histories with titles like Staff Movement Ledger, Reconciliation. In March 1942, the special liaison units assigned to number 10 Downing Street were instructed to tighten documentation. It was framed as routine, but the real impulse came from an unspoken anxiety. Convoy losses could no longer be explained purely by German cryptographic luck. The Admiralty had begun seeing patterns that felt impossible. Too many submarine groups were in the right latitude band at the right hour, before the Luftwaffe ever shadowed, or before B-Dienst analysts could plausibly have broken enough naval key material on their own. SLU personnel were the couriers of the most sensitive fact in the British Empire, that Germany's vaunted enigma had never been fully secure. These couriers carried the ultra decrypts from Bletchley Park, often on motorcycles, and hand-delivered them into the map room of the Cabinet War Rooms, where select clerks summarised them into small briefing cards for the Prime Minister's morning reading box. The chain of custody was small. Names appear repeatedly in the logs, and it is here, in the margins of these logs, that the anomaly emerges. A young record clerk, we still do not have authorization to print his name because his identity remains redacted in 2023. FOIA releases, appears in the audit with subtle irregularities. A bank account uptick, a change in personal dress and shoes, noted by a supervisor in an unrelated welfare interview. And critically, a 3-day absence with no recorded reason. His desk assignment? Admiralty routing sheets for mid-ocean convoys. Specifically, the traffic associated with convoy. SC-107 convoy, SC-107 left. Halifax on 24th October 1942. 42 merchant ships, escorted initially by a relatively weak screen, later reinforced in mid-ocean by Royal Navy and RCN destroyers and corvettes. It was winter North Atlantic weather, dense cloud, gale force winds, poor radar windows, the type of operational environment where Allied intelligence believed ultra gave them asymmetric advantage. If Admiralty planners had precise ultra insight into Wolfpack deployments, they could shift convoys out of danger envelopes. But in this case, the enemy moved with uncanny anticipation. The German Wolfpack, Hecht, was waiting. Over the course of the engagement beginning 1st November, the pack sank 15 ships. It was one of the worst single convoy losses of the war, and here is the archival knife edge. The routing summary sheet that would have been placed on Churchill's desk that week passed through the record clerk in Bletchley analysts in Hut 3 partially decrypted German naval traffic later and were baffled. The Germans adjusted their search lines even after ultra-prompted repositioning. Someone, somewhere, appeared to have informed them of Britain's ultra-derived correction. MI5's B1B quietly cross-checked SLU log signatures. They discovered that the clerk's 72-hour unaccounted period coincided exactly with the moment ultra-based routing. Corrections were typed into number 10's map room summary sheet. There is no arrest record, no interrogation transcript, at least none we can read. What we have are fragments. A personnel file reference that ends with the line "resigned." A War Office memo showing his later posting request was approved. But then, silent paper, a missing road. One operations officer, years later, the late Ralph Bennett, a Bletchley historian, wrote that sometimes the Germans seemed to react to ultra-knowledge before they could possibly have known. Historians argued whether this was exaggeration, the natural fog of war, or retrospective narratives by those who lived through the tension of the Atlantic crisis. But the convoy losses around SC-107 were not narrative. They were dead ships, cold steel, oil on Blackwater, more than 540 lives lost, and an intelligence signature line inside that disaster leads in closed file form directly into the Prime Minister's office handling chain. There is no accusation. There is only the undeniable fact that someone inside the very limited circle of ultra distribution in number 10 had both motive opportunity and unaccounted windows of time, and that the operational consequence was real, measurable, quantifiable. Men and ships destroyed in the mid-ocean gap, the very space ultra was intended to protect. The file trails in this period end abruptly. Stamped, then nothing. But the timing alignment is razor sharp. A 3-day disappearance. A convoy destroyed, a wolf pack that moved faster than German cryptanalytic capabilities. The implication hangs unresolved. If Ultra was compromised, even briefly, then the heart of British wartime secrecy was breached from the inside. Next, we'll introduce the inter-service rivalry over who owned the mole hunt, MI5 versus SIS. There is a persistent misunderstanding that Britain's counter-espionage machine in Sakun was a single, unified, razor-sharp instrument. It was not. It was a mosaic of fiefdoms, rival mandates, personal grudges, and jurisdictional trenches, especially when intelligence activity touched the inner political sanctum of 10 Downing Street. In late 1942 and early 1943, as the pattern of suspiciously pre-aligned German U-boat deployments grew harder to dismiss as coincidence, the question of which security service should own an internal mole hunt quietly metastasized into a political dilemma. On the one hand, MI5's B division rightly saw the leak as a domestic penetrative threat, a counterintelligence matter inside British soil. On the other, SIS, MI6, believed the profile smelled like foreign service handling, likely run from a station abroad. And in the middle of this silent tug-of-war sat Churchill's private office, refusing to admit, even to itself, that a traitor might be physically seated within, walking distance of the map room. It is at this moment in history that the future arch-defector Kim Philby enters the margins of our story, not as the orchestrator of this breach, but as an atmospheric data point on the culture of the time. Philby in 1943 was still rising in MI6's Section FI, counter-espionage. His later betrayal of Britain would become a geopolitical rupture of the Cold War. But in 1943, his relevance is structural. Section FIV was already quietly maneuvering for ownership of intra-government mole jurisdiction before the word Gordievsky, Yurchenko, or even Cambridge 5 had entered the public lexicon decades later. The point is not that Philby was the Churchill office mole. Historians reject that. But that Section V's ambitions framed the bureaucratic psychology of this exact moment in the war. SIS wanted to own this hunt. MI5 believed that was insane. This subtle rivalry becomes pivotal when one studies the actual routing diagrams of Ultra Packet, handling for naval traffic, GC&CS, government code, and cipher school would break the keys. HUT 3 or HUT 8 would summary translate. SLU couriers delivered to number 10, and then internal clerks re-summarized into the PM's morning digest. Now consider what MI6 argued. If the leak was so fast, then the controlling hand might not be German at all, but Soviet. A Soviet angle would fall under their purview, not MI5's. And here is the uncomfortable context. 1943 is the Stalingrad period. Moscow is no longer the desperate ally begging for survival. It is an ally emerging into power. Soviet intelligence activity in Britain expanded aggressively that year. NKVD Residentura officers in London adopted more active collection postures. The British state was fully aware of this shift, but political leadership could not publicly treat ally as a counterintelligence category. So, the question split the room. What Bletchley saw next poured accelerant on that schism. Between mid-May and early July 1943, HUT 3 logged 5 incidents in which Luftwaffe fuel staging tables for Trondheim-Bardufoss forward fields, critical for maritime reconnaissance, showed altered German deployments after ultra-sourced corrections were forwarded to the PM's office. The time deltas were sometimes under 6 hours. That was too fast for conventional B-Dienst exploitation. Analysts didn't say mole, they wrote correlated anomaly. The phrasing is bureaucratic, but the implication is radioactive, someone with access to the PM's ultra, pages or to the summaries typed in the map room, was potentially signaling changes. Out of the building, a diary entry from an anonymous female typist, preserved in the IWM oral history series, captures the mood. We knew the Atlantic was bleeding, but it was never clear whether the bleeding was simply from battle or from the inside. This is not melodrama. This is the testimony of the hands that typed the very briefings Churchill read. And MI6, sensing a jurisdictional opening, perhaps opportunistically, began to frame the event in memos as possibly foreign run. If it was foreign run, they owned the chase. MI5 countered. The speed was too fast, meaning the handoff was local, which meant the mole was domestic, which meant MI5 owned it. Churchill, for all his famed instincts, sided with MI6 in tone, not because he had firm evidence, but because the notion of a German penetration of his office was psychologically unacceptable. The Soviets were, at least on paper, allies. So, a Soviet penetration was narratively easier to file in the brain as intelligence friction between states. It is a remarkable, almost tragic human truth of wartime leadership. The story one can emotionally accept often becomes the story one investigates. And that institutional blind spot, that reluctance to face the unbearable possibility that a traitor was physically seated beneath that reinforced concrete ceiling, forms the hinge of everything that would come next. Was the inner circle compromised by a German source? Or did the Soviets exploit a window that no one wanted to recognize? The record is brutally incomplete. The only thing we know with certainty is that the German Navy, in 1943, reacted too fast too often, and coincidence no longer explained it. Next, the Hamburg correlation and the narrowing of suspects. In the spring and summer of 1943, a new intelligence pattern emerged. Not at Bletchley, not in London, but inside an Abwehr regional command post 570 miles away, Ast Hamburg. At first glance, this German field station was simply one more coastal hub handling naval signals, agent reporting, shipping reconnaissance, and radio traffic fusion for BDU, U-boat command. But in declassified post-war interrogations and captured documents examined in the 1950s by the British Naval Intelligence Division, Ast Hamburg's traffic volume began showing an intelligence density curve that outpaced its historical baseline, even though its cryptanalytic capacity had not changed. If the Germans had not suddenly gotten better at breaking British or Canadian naval ciphers, then the only remaining explanation was just as alarming. They were being fed positional insight. Inside the British analytical sphere, this Hamburg anomaly became the first independently detected echo of the presumed leak inside the Churchill chain. Bletchley analysts cross-referenced time order. They matched 5 ultra-driven course correction advisories, 3 in May, 2 in June, to convoys in the North Atlantic. The Admiralty used those ultra reports to shift mid-ocean rendezvous points. Then, within hours, German wolf packs repositioned, sometimes by 60 to 90 nautical miles. When plotted onto a Mercator sheet, the German movements were a mirror trace of the ultra-based shifts inside the Prime Minister's Morning Digest logs. Here is the killer detail. Of every office in Britain that saw those specific ultra-correction summaries, only one room had all of them, Churchill's map room. The narrowing began, MI5's B1B and Naval Section. X formed a joint internal working group, quietly, to narrow a suspect list strictly to individuals with A, map room access authority, and B, hands-on handling of the typed ultra-summary card sets. That list, depending which version of the 1943 internal briefing one reads, is 6 civilian clerks and 1 naval liaison officer attached on rotational assignment from the Admiralty for high-priority Atlantic plotting. The naval liaison officer stands out for several reasons, not as an accusation, but because his duty ledger has 3 rare characteristics. He had authority to physically handle ultra-summary sheets. He had operational knowledge of convoy routing beyond the gulf of summary typing. He had an independent pre-war travel pattern that intersected with neutral ports. Lisbon, Madrid, transit hubs notorious for German field officer traffic. The British state still redacts his name in surviving FOIA-released files. Historians refer to him only by the generic category, the naval liaison officer. The German documentation pressure rises at precisely the same time. Ast Hamburg's reporting cadence spikes in late 1943. Their captured signals logs show a rhythm, a quiet period, then sudden bursts of convoy-adjacent targeting clarity. Not every day, not continuous, but patterned. Each spike, plotted retrospectively, sits downstream of ultra content that passed through number 10. Accept what that means. It was not random dripping. It looked like a faucet. Meanwhile, in London, an institutional paralysis took hold. Arresting anyone, even temporarily, would have forced Churchill to publicly acknowledge, at least inside the security state, that the leak was not theoretical. But an accusation against the wrong man would have detonated a constitutional scandal on top of wartime governance. It would have meant the PM's own inner sanctum had been infiltrated to a level that threatened Alliance morale precisely in the window, where Sicily was being planned and the Atlantic reached sustainable parity. So the compromise was silence in MI5 marginalia, which survive only because some analysts scribbled their notes in the outer margins of briefing folders. There is a phrase repeated more than once. The proof required exceeds the proof available. In other words, suspicion was strong enough to narrow down the handful of individuals who could have been the leak, but not strong enough to produce admissible, irrefutable evidence necessary to bring a charge. Bureaucracy, not failure, made the case insoluble. In September 1943, the file chain shows a chilling detail. The naval liaison officer requested a medical leave of absence on vague grounds. The leave was approved. Weeks later, he disappeared from London records, not vanished into myth, just into a bureaucratic void. A posting request, a medical note, then a travel pattern leading toward Lisbon, a city openly infamous as wartime espionage transfer terrain between Axis and neutral hands. None of that constitutes legal proof of treason, but all of it constitutes probability. By late 1943, the internal investigation reached a cliff edge, technically narrowed, politically stalled. The mole list was tiny, down to a handful of desks. But the price of moving too soon was judged greater than the price of waiting. And so the window remained. Open. Convoy signals kept bleeding. And the truth, if there ever was a single, definitive truth, slipped with a passport through a neutral port. Next, the resignation, the Lisbon Trail, and the forensic puzzle of the summary sheet that should never have left Britain. In January 1944, a thin, one-sentence notation entered the administrative bloodstream of Whitehall. It appeared first in a duty officer's log, then duplicated in a typed monthly staffing report for the Admiralty's personnel branch. The entry was structurally unremarkable. 4 words and a date stamp. Resigned on medical grounds. No diagnosis, no follow-on clearance note, no return to duty window, just an exit. This line, paper-thin, clinically phrased, unillustrative, is the only overt official record that the naval liaison officer ever left the map-room chain. But the timing is nuclear. It lands immediately after the Hamburg anomaly curve peaks for the last time. The spike vanishes, the pattern ends, and a man leaves London. We do not have a smoking gun. We do not have a confession, but we do have an outcome. The man, whose file is still redacted, travelled outward through Lisbon. Neutral Portugal was the hinge between Axis territory and the free Atlantic. Lisbon's docks and hotel bars were a bazaar of wartime intelligence barter. SD case officers running Spanish border couriers to Madrid, British SIS operatives monitoring transatlantic shipping manifests, OSS station watchers looking for Italian armistice defectors, Abwehr officers booking airline seats on KLM or Lufthansa flights under diplomatic cover. The naval liaison officer's disappearance into Lisbon, not Geneva, not Stockholm, reads like someone intentionally entering the most dangerous marketplace in WWII Europe, a place where you could sell information by the page. British archives confirm the movement not by narrative, testimony, but by financial footprint. Wartime currency control records show that someone matching his coded file reference obtained a foreign exchange authorization for sterling, a scudo, in January 44. That currency action required Treasury signature. It passed. He moved. Beyond that, no British customs re-entry stamp, no repatriation slip. Nothing. The trail simply stops on the Atlantic rim of a neutral pipeline. The shocks of this period are not purely espionage abstractions. They materialize in metal and blood. In the first week of February 1944, days after the officer's departure, U-Boat Command quietly adjusted its own operational doctrine. In BDU's FUMBI-related tactical directive, number 4, captured post-war, the Germans corrected a long-standing targeting assumption involving mid-ocean convoy zigzag patterns. The correction is tiny, 1 sentence. But people who have studied ultra-trajectory files have pointed out something devastating. The correction presupposes knowledge not of an Enigma decrypt, but of the British précis of an Enigma decrypt. In other words, somebody with access to the edited summary sheet, the map-room condensation, not the raw intercept, was feeding the Germans. That detail has always been the knife, because the only place in Britain where those specific condensed summary cards were held, physically held, was Churchill's map room. was that single line in the BDU directive, inserted because of one last information drip before the Lisbon departure. No historian can prove that, but the timing aligns within a fortnight, and the German doctrine correction was not broadcast or propaganda. It was an internal U-boat operating document. This is the type of alignment that drives archivists insane. They cannot prove conspiracy, but they cannot prove coincidence either. Most war histories like closure, a culprit unmasked, a motive explained, a punishment delivered. But the Atlantic War did not give Britain this luxury. There was no trial, no public naming, no post-war parliamentary inquiry. After 1947, when the first wave of ultra-declassification began in tiny, sanitized fragments, the name of the Naval Liaison Officer was already sealed under Section 3 of the Official Secrets Act. What remains are traces: abandoned airport manifests in Lisbon, an unexplained foreign exchange request, a personnel ledger line, 2 late-war BDU tactical corrections, an immeasurable drop in German convoy interception, acuity after January 1944. Correlation is not proof, but correlation in this case is the only ghost that survived. Navy historians in the 70s used to say that sometimes the most important thing in the archive is not what is there, but what stops. Here, the German predictive curve stops. The British mole hunt paperwork stops, and the Naval Liaison Officer's London identity stops. One man exits the chain. One intelligence signature disappears from the ocean's surface, and the Atlantic, slowly, painfully, begins to tilt in Britain's favor. In the final part, we trace what the post-1945 audit teams tried to reconstruct, and how one line remains blacked out even today. In the summer of 1945, as the war in Europe ended and the air inside Whitehall finally lost the metallic taste of imminent defeat, the post-mortem work began. Not the political post-mortems, those came later, but the forensic ones. The invisible autopsies. MI5 and Naval Intelligence established a retrospective working board to reconstruct a simple, brutal question. Who, if anyone, had used Churchill's inner office as a conduit for enemy insight? It was not framed as a witch hunt. It was framed as a risk assessment. If Ultra had been compromised from within, then that breach was not merely an operational tragedy. It was a structural precedent. A structural precedent that could, in later years, be repeated against the next adversary, whoever that might be. The audit teams were not looking for gossip, motives, psychology, or biography. They wanted timelines, and timelines are unforgiving things. They took the big black war binder, SLU, PMO distribution, Atlantic, and they laid it across a table. Then they laid German submarine operations logs beside it, the ones captured from BDU's central archive at Flensburg. Then they laid the maproom summary logs on a third line. They ran a steel ruler across all 3. It is chilling to read the technical prose from those meetings. Event correlation is non-zero. That's all it says. A sentence that is almost clinically bloodless. And yet soaked in implication, the analysts found 4 periods in which Ultra derived. Course corrections passed through the Prime Minister's office, and the Germans pivoted faster than the Germans could plausibly have read British traffic, unless British traffic had been tipped. Could this have been B-Dienst cryptanalytic breakthrough? Possibly, but the signal rhythm did not look like it. B-Dienst's successes tended to pulse in clusters when they had a key advantage. These instances looked like on-demand advantage, like someone, somewhere, was quietly signaling. The retroactive review board never wrote mole. They never wrote traitor. They never assigned motive or political alignment. Their phrasing is even stranger, almost as if they were afraid of their own conclusion. Access vector from high office likely present. Vector, not person. Access, not deliberate intent. Likely present, not confirmed. That's the scar tissue of bureaucratic trauma. The unwillingness to write in plain ink what the numbers were screaming. The identity column, the single field that would identify the Naval Liaison Officer, is blacked out in modern FOIA release PDFs. The redaction block in digital view covers roughly 22 characters. It is the only line in the entire file redacted. Not the dates, not the travel ledger fragment, not the Forex authorization, only the name. Why is the name redacted today? The Official Secrets Act has a long shadow. In some cases, names remain redacted not to protect the traitor, but to protect the bureaucrat who failed to stop him. Sometimes redactions exist to protect a wartime ally whose post-war role became geopolitically complicated. And sometimes, and this is the most uncomfortable truth, a name remains sealed because the government knows the public cannot process the idea that the betrayal worked. Historians debate whether the perpetrator was German-run or Soviet-run. The German maritime doctrine alignment points toward an Abwehr maritime desk. But the internal MI6 memoranda in 1943, the ones pushing the Soviet angle, are not irrational either. The Soviet residentura in London was busy, aggressive and opportunistic. It is possible, not proven, but possible, that the mole was handled via a chain that blurred both worlds. Lisbon was a crossroads where lines bent, where men could meet Germans on Tuesday, Soviets on Wednesday, talk to OSS watchers Thursday, and sail to Rio by Friday. The point is not to solve the case. The case as it exists cannot be solved. It is a ruin, a structural ruin, a collapsed foundation line in the archaeology of the secret war. But the outcome is not a mystery. From mid-1942 until January 1944, U-boat groups repeatedly pre-positioned with unnatural prescience against convoys whose routing was informed by Ultra. Then the naval liaison officer left London. The pattern stopped. Hundreds of transport ships survived that. Otherwise might not have men lived. That is the brutal ledger line. The story of the spy in Churchill's office will always be incomplete, because the last missing piece is still held under lock. One name, 22 characters, blacked out not because of lack of evidence, but because the state decided the world was never entitled to certainty. We are left with this: evidence without attribution, cause without identity, and an intelligence weapon used, in the shadows, against the very office that carried the war's most closely guarded secret. That is Britain's deepest betrayal.